Hi, my name is Hannah, and this is my digital story. This is me on my bike Hermes during orientation week. Hermes was a gift from my quasi-father Craig, the father of my best friend, Connor. I've lived with them over the summer. The bike was salvaged from a dump in the 70s and is one of my most prized possessions. The gray frost shirt indicates that I'm the Vice President External on the Executive of the King's Students Union. As you can see, I'm proudly sporting my KSU buttons for various campaigns. There's Education is a Right, a campaign on accessible education, United for Equity, a campaign that challenges systems of oppression and marginalization, and No Means No, a campaign around ending gender-based violence and sexualized violence on our campus and moving forward with consent culture. As a member of the executive, I engage and support union members with external and internal campaigns. I represent Kings at the Canadian Federation of Students Nova Scotia. I oversee the External Action Committee, Sustainability Committee, and Campus Safety Committee. I supervise the Sustainability Officer and the Campus Safety Coordinator. I liaise with union-levy societies like NSPERG and South House, and I'm responsible for the implementation of the union's policies regarding external affairs, ethical spending, and sustainability. And sometimes my job is just to help organize mass student uprisings, like the Day of Action last year. This is me with blue hair. While I don't always have blue hair, there are certain aspects of my identity which I cannot change. My given name is Hannah Sedaris Hirsch. I use my middle name Kaya as a last name, and have done so since I was 10. I was born in Toronto, but grew up in Ottawa, the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. I am a white, cisgender, vaguely straight woman, and I come from a lower middle-class background. I understand that this affords me certain social and political privileges, and I work to challenge the systems of power from which I benefit. My family on my mom's side emigrated from Greece in the 60s in order to escape violence and poverty. They settled in Montreal North, the traditional Ganawaki Mohawk territory. My mom is a theater artist, operating out of Toronto. She used to be political in her youth before discovering her spirituality. Now she provides love and healing for her communities through her teaching, her friendship, and her craft. This is my dad. We look alike. My dad's side moved from the States during the Vietnam War. Here we are at my dad's wedding. I was his best man. My dad lives in Brooklyn with his wife, Emmanuel. This is them winning first prize in a New York Newark musical theater festival. My grandfather is the one wearing the Oxy sticker. He's a trade unionist, labor organizer for the United Steelworkers, civil rights defender, pacifist, and came to Canada to dodge the draft after he was conscripted. He was one of the first civil rights protesters in Massachusetts. He gave up pursuing his doctoral thesis in order to work in a steel factory for Inglis, where he became president of the local chapter of the United Steelworkers Union, and fought to raise the standard of living for his brothers, sisters, and comrades. Growing up, both my parents were artists and New Age hippies, and I couldn't understand where I picked up my radical politics. I now know it came from my grandfather. Last year, I started learning about Canada's role in the environmental crisis. I remember my roommate in first year, Haley, explaining to me what environmental racism was. I was horrified and disgusted by the fact that toxic resource extraction was disproportionately done in regions occupied by First Nations people in Canada, and that those people suffered from higher rates of health complications and the loss of their traditional means of livelihood. Haley came from a long line of climate justice activists and had visited the tar sands during a healing walk organized by the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation. She developed a chemical sensitivity because of her time spent near Fort McMurray. This was really when I first became interested in Canada's relationship with its Indigenous population and how I could work to ameliorate it. The People's Climate March in New York happened during my first few weeks of university. Needing an excuse to see my father and wanting to be a part of the People's Environmental Movement, I, with a few friends, joined my great-great-aunt and uncle, my Grammy, my dad, his wife, and over 400,000 people on the streets of New York. It's interesting to see what each of the 4 generations of activists my family has produced has taken up. My great-great-uncle was a Marxist-Leninist Maoist and has dedicated his life to the economic liberation of the people. My grandfather devoted his life challenging racial discrimination, the military-industrial complex, and income inequity. My mom and dad took up the feminist banner and fought for gay rights. And me? I'm proud to belong to a national students organization that understands intersectionality. Students understand that equity issues act as a barrier to access to post-secondary education. In the last week of November, delegates from member locals across the country attended the National General Meeting of the Canadian Federation of Students. We took part in anti-oppression workshops and attended panels on topics such as combating anti-Black racism and Islamophobia, and how to stand in solidarity with Indigenous communities as an ally. The Federation has been actively lobbying the government to remove the cap on post-secondary student support program, or PSSP, and to uphold the treaty right to education. As Vice President External, I take my allyship very seriously. I understand that an ally is not a static position and requires a daily commitment to social justice and human rights. I start every meeting with an acknowledgement of the unceded and unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory upon which we study, organize, and are guests. I also understand that I am in a position to be able to provide support and opportunities to help marginalized students build strong communities of resistance. This past week, I organized a blanket exercise, an exercise aimed at educating settler students about the land they study on, run by Caros. But there's still a long ways to go. I only really started learning about Indigenous issues when I came to Halifax. I can remember seeing I Don't Know More stickers plastered in Parliament on the bus ride to school, but I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood and went to a predominantly white school. I knew that Canada's past was far from the sanitized narrative we'd been fed in middle school history class, but I didn't yet have the tools to challenge that narrative. I began learning about Canada's dark colonial past. Since the 1600s, the Indigenous people of Canada have been victims of colonial violence inflicted on them by European settlers in the name of an imperialist agenda. The settlers did everything in their power to attempt to systematically destroy the strength, resilience, culture, and livelihood of Canada's Indigenous population. I find the legacy of Canada's residential school system particularly horrifying. In the past 2 years, I've had the privilege of listening to survivors recount the abuse and trauma they faced at the hands of the residential school system and the intergenerational effects it's had. In the late 1870s, the Canadian government began investigating ways in which they could solve the quote-unquote Indian problem. This inquiry sparked what would soon become the horrific legacy of the Canadian residential school system, which was inspired by the use of industrial boarding schools in the States to naturalize and assimilate Indigenous children while preparing them for a life of low-paying trade jobs. Children were systematically and purposefully removed from their families and cultures in an act of state-sanctioned genocide. The goal of the schools was to kill the Indian in the child, under the guise of assimilation politics. Occasionally in Canada, I've encountered the racist rhetoric of the quote-unquote lazy Indian. There's a false perception of Indigenous people as being leeches on society, or drunks, or ne'er-do-wells, but we know this isn't the case. Those stereotypes benefit dominant social regimes, which fear the concession of power and therefore attempt to reify negative societal perceptions of certain social groups. Rob Canoe poignantly states, "First we got the plague, then we got the plague of whiskey." The federal government has institutionally and systematically mistreated, undermined, marginalized, oppressed, lied to, and even left for dead the Indigenous population since contact. Before the residential school system was put in place, the Indigenous people were at the very least able to retain their communal solidarity and their cultural practices, traditions, and generational knowledge. Residential schools almost succeeded in erasing the possibility of parents being able to pass on their culture to their children. Children were never given the love and affection they need, and they were taught to be ashamed of their culture and themselves. This separation led to generations of people who didn't know how to be parents, and the cycle of abuse continued. The blood of the students that died as a result of racist assimilation policy and the residential school system will forever be a stain on Canadian history. I am constantly inspired by the resilience of Canada's Indigenous population, and the rest of Canada is starting to wake up. It is my responsibility, and I feel the responsibility of those like me, to use our privilege and stand by Canada's First Nations in their battle for sovereignty and equitable treatment. With the knowledge I've gained in this class comes great opportunity and great responsibility. I hope to be able to use this information to actively work towards reconciliation with my Indigenous brothers sisters, two-spirited people, and comrades of all sorts. We are all treaty people, and this is my history. The least I can do is change the way we treat each other on a legislative as well as a person-to-person basis.